Man, you look like an official podcaster. That that's crazy.
Uh,
Where's my headset?
you want a headset? Because he asked me about that. I'm like, I don't know. Do you want me to ask him, dude?
I thought I asked him, but he never got back to me.
All
So,
right, let me work on this because I'm taking. He's got to drop his car off tonight, so I'll definitely see
and
if
you
I can
got a
get you.
mic too. Look at you with a mic. That's so funny.
Oh, dude, how's your day going, man?
I'm tired. Yeah, I'm
You
so
you look
tired.
tired. You really
Yeah.
do.
Gee, thanks.
And look, get this. He comes over today. He's dropping the stuff off, and I'm telling him a little bit about what we're doing. And he starts dropping names on me, and I'm like, I've never heard of this guy. You probably told Mike Hauser. Is there a Mike Hauser? Does that name sound familiar?
Not that I'm not
That
that
is
I'm
it.
aware of.
A divine counsel or something like that. That he's been. He a lot of stuff he was talking about. I'm like this sounds like it syncs with what you were saying. So
No, it's funny. Like I got a mic during the beginning of the pandemic because I wanted to start a podcast for forever. Yeah, I've been listening to podcasts since like 2015, maybe even earlier than that. Um, and I remember getting a mic and it's just collecting dust in my closet. I got it off of Amazon, but I don't have headphones, so
yeah,
I don't know how it kind of links together.
he's
But
got a little box here that connects them all together, and then it's powered by really your phone. You just plug it into your phone, and then it juices everything up, and you're good to go. So
man,
let me
I'm
let me let me.
yeah, I'm in awe of like how professional I look right now. Now I'm the co-host.
And I ask him, like, what are you doing this afternoon? He says, I got to go back and edit podcasts. He says, I got a couple I got to work on. Guy was looking for him. So I think he was behind on the deadline, man.
Oh man.
So, but no, I'll talk to him. I'll talk to him for sure. Cause
Yeah.
that sounds good. Look at
Yeah. I still can't stop looking at it. It's funny.
you. But yeah, he dropped off the mic stand and everything just hooks to the desk here and everything. It's pretty sweet, dude.
Yeah, it's so funny because like you're like the most I don't want to say
Oh, say it.
what.
Say it.
No, no,
I'm
no. No, I was gonna say like when we originally started this podcast, it almost seemed like you wanted to be super like low tech and you didn't want to get super invested. And now you have the vest, you have the mic.
oh, dude.
Oh man. Well, yeah, like my day started at like 4 in the morning, so
No,
it's
Isaiah,
yeah, it's been a long day.
you
Yeah.
gotta be toast, man.
Yeah, but there's nothing energy drinks and caffeine can't cure.
We know
So
this.
I'm powering through,
We
but
know this.
it kind of pairs really well with the topic that I want to talk about today. So I think I think I'll be in good spirits, and I usually do really well when I'm really exhausted. So
Okay.
uh, I'll be okay. Welcome to the Generation F podcast. F stands for faith. This show is about having real conversations on wrestling with faith between two different generations' perspectives. I'm joined today with my co host Phil, who now has a new mic and headphones. And my name is Isaiah, and we're going to go over a new series labeled Willingness Without Sight. All right. So, this was an interesting topic that I wanted to really go into, and it kind of leads really well from the last few episodes that we had talking about invisible faith. We can go on forever on that. I mean, we could essentially create a podcast just off of invisible faith, but I don't want to just continue down topics for too long. There's a lot of questions that people that listen to these podcasts ask me, so I want to just kind of keep rotating themes. So this idea of willingness without sight, the question that I was asked was by actually a client of mine. And he had a really interesting question that we're going to kind of break up, Phil, between you and I. I'll let you kind of answer first, and then I'll answer second. And then I have supporting scriptures that I want to kind of break out into. And then we're going to continue down this rabbit hole. His question was, uh, what was the idea behind willingness for the older generations? He didn't want to be specific on boomers versus anyone else, but when we think of willingness in a spiritual lens, right? Not like the Webster's dictionary version of willingness, which I actually have here. It's essentially the quality or state of being prepared to do something or readiness, right? But when we think of things in a spiritual lens, like the older generations, what did they see willingness defined as, or what were some examples of things that willingness meant to them?
Yeah, great question, Isaiah. I mean, as you were talking that question and came through with that, I just had to think that word willingness. It was part of the dictionary when I was growing up, but not really when it came to spiritual life. A better word would have been expectations. Growing up in the church, there were certain things that you were expected to do as part of your walk with God, and that's kind of how I learned some of the fundamentals. And the notion of willingness kind of came after as I got older. It's like, wow, this I don't have to, I get to, and that's kind of, that phrase is kind of borrowed from our church as well too. Um, it's a wow. And I hate to say joy because that sounds like it's an overstatement, but it really is at times anymore to serve God and to serve Jesus in everyday life, as opposed to an expectation. It's kind of how I first learned that notion of willingness. You know, you weren't willing; you were expected to do certain things to carry out your responsibilities as a believer. And so that was kind of a hard lesson for me to drop the expectations. You know, what am I expected to do, or what's the least that I can do to where I am now to say, well, I get to serve God. He has done so much for me, um, that I want to do for Him, and I think that's kind of been an evolution of my faith, and the willingness kind of came with that as well too. You want to do it. Whatever it is, you know, whether it's in our church, we have a serve food service piece, food rescue, um, that can be hard, getting up early, and you know, winter, all months of the year you're outside, and sometimes you know, your flesh might want to question that, like, why am I here? What am I doing this for? You know, but the Spirit says, wow, there's a need. Let's do this. You know, let's help people. So I think the willingness kind of overrides the part of me that says, what am I doing here? It's cold out here. I don't want to be here. I could be doing other things. And the willingness kind of comes along and says, no, this is what I, you know, kind of override. Like I said, it overrides that part of me that doesn't want to follow God in that moment.
Yeah, I love that word that you said, expectations, because I've, again, we don't solely represent generations' perspectives, but we can have a little bit more of a connection to our peers, right? And that's one of the things that I want to kind of carry out with this podcast is you know the peers that we are surrounded by and how we kind of perceive certain things. The expectations piece is so foreign to me, with the younger generations, and I find that very interesting because it kind of marries really well with some of the other conversations we've had where you've talked about faith being handed down to you, right? So the idea of expectations implies that you already had like a pecking order. There was already something that you understood had to be done. So
Yeah.
willingness is perceived within this lens of duty, right?
Mhm.
Um, Within my answer, I had to kind of think about it, you know, because when I was with my client and we were talking about this question, you know, I had to ask myself, what defines willingness within my generation? And I kind of came to a couple of conclusions because most of the definitions aren't necessarily represented by faith, but they marry really well with faith. And what I kind of came up with was the idea of having a physical action of doing something despite the desire to do so, right? And that kind of summarizes a lot of things that I want to convey to anyone that kind of stumbles upon the show is the idea that uh, the younger generations struggle to have that hand me down faith, that gifted faith. So we're trying to wrestle with so many different ideas and technologies and just all the extra information that we get flooded with on a daily basis. So the idea of having faith seems almost unnecessary. But, for me, the notion of knowing that I'm deficient in something, right? Knowing that I don't have something in my life. Maybe it's purpose, maybe it's, um, knowledge of, you know, what's going to happen to me in life, or, what happens to me if I die, or what happens to me when I'm alive. All these questions that I might have are kind of surrounded by this idea of, the willingness to accept an idea that you may not want to have, right? An idea that maybe you don't prescribe to, or an idea that maybe you just don't like, right? I kind of gave in my testimony on my last episode was not really wanting to have a relationship with God, but knowing that, kind of like you said, an expectation. Like I had an expectation that I knew I had to fulfill. And that was enough for God to do things in my life, to change these smaller variables and these smaller, circumstances for me to see a need for Him, right? And I come about these definitions in more of like a secular perspective, or the idea of the definition not necessarily pertaining to spirituality, more so because the people that I talk to largely don't have faith. They don't
Mhm.
they don't know who Jesus is. They don't know they're being surrounded by so many different new age ideas and different religious perspectives, right? So willingness is an interesting launching pad to really kind of dive down these next couple episodes, because it is invisible, but you also don't have to want to be a part of it in essence. There needs to be a willingness to go down a certain road,
Yeah,
even if you don't believe that the answer is for you at the end.
absolutely. Agreed.
I have a few scriptures that I wanted to kind of go into that kind of really highlight the idea of willingness and how I feel it pertains to faith. This week, I want to stay in the New Testament. They're actually both in the book of Matthew, which is the first book in the New Testament. The first scripture that we have, and I'll let you turn to it, Phil, but it's Matthew chapter 8, verse 2. In this story, there's essentially like a diseased man who is on the outskirts of society. Within that time period, if you had certain diseases like leprosy, like you were like a pariah, like you weren't invited into stores, like you had to kind of sit on the outskirts, right? You were basically homeless. Um, and so this leper is confronted with Jesus, and this is like a dialogue that kind of happens that marries with the topic.
And when he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and bowed to him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And he, Jesus, stretched out his hand, touched him, saying, I am willing, be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed.
Yeah, I love that translation, and I love that scripture because one of the things that this truly highlights is how much Jesus values willingness, right? if you read that translation or other translations that say something a little different in terms of the verbiage of willingness, he doesn't ask the leper or the diseased person to sell all his belongings and do XYZ things to get favor or to achieve some kind of, um, you know, standing with Jesus, right? He doesn't ask for him to do some kind of a pilgrimage or anything extraneous. Jesus asks the leper if he's willing. And out of that willingness, comes the transformation, right? And that's such an important thing for me to read because in most cases, uh, I rarely want to do any of the things that I'm supposed to do. You know, throughout the week, I'm busy, I'm working all the time. There's so many distractions in my life and in the world around me. It's very hard to walk this path, right? To kind of continue down this road, no matter where you are in faith. But one of the things that always, one of the things that always remind me of how God uses us in our how he uses us in the bigger picture is by our willingness, right? It's by our willingness that we're made different,
Yep.
right? It's by our willingness that the changes in our lives occur. Phil, I just wanted you to kind of add any kind of comments or ideas on that scripture.
Absolutely. I love the guy when he comes to Jesus, uh, his position and recognition. When he he came to Jesus, he bowed down and said, "Lord." So there's obviously it went past recognition to faith. It's like he understood who he was
Mm,
and stepped into the moment and addressed him properly. Lord,
mm,
and he's on his face. Um, and I like that. He's not coming as a prove it or lose it type of person.
mhm.
He recognizes Jesus for who he is, and then doesn't demand. He just simply says the question, "I know if you're willing." Um,
Right.
and to me, I think when I talk about faith, um, in my life, my experience has been so far, overstepping God's direction or assuming that He wants me in a certain spot or to do a certain thing, and then having to be either corrected or God just going silent in prayer life, and I see none of that in this example. He didn't overstep. He didn't ask of Jesus something that he knew that might not be answered. He just acknowledged him, recognized who he was, and put the question out there.
Yeah, I love that statement that you said about acknowledging who he's talking to, right? And I believe that God knows our heart,
Mm.
right? And even if we say things out of character, there's this understanding of a desire to get to know answers,
Yeah,
right? So a lot
yeah,
of times with people, they may not know how to address God properly, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that he's not going to acknowledge your willingness. But I do love that commentary with the idea that um, there was a recognition of authority, right? There was this acknowledgement that, hey, like, listen, I'm down on my luck,
yeah,
for
yeah.
lack of a better way of saying it, but I know who I'm talking to, right?
And
And
I
I think
miss
that's,
that a lot too. Um, the older I get, sometimes I miss that I am talking even in prayer life or just talking throughout the day that geez, we're talking to the creator of the universe. We're talking to God, through
uh,
Jesus. And it's like, oh yeah, maybe I should restate my word there or request. Um, and I think that's a lesson learned for me. A lot of times I just, miss who I'm talking to.
yeah, that's like an experience, like
Hmm.
understanding, right? And especially coming from my background, I maybe understood that concept, but it didn't materialize in my head the way
Yeah.
it should have.
Yeah.
But he uses that.
Absolutely.
The next scripture in the book of Matthew that I have is Matthew 21. It's verses 28 through 31, depending on your translation. Sometimes the verses get kind of broken up a little differently, but I'll let you get there and then I'm going to read it because I have my children's Bible out.
Sounds good. 28,
And
Isaiah.
yeah,
21,
yeah,
28.
21, 28. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's a story about two sons, right? This is a parable. So what that means is an allegory used to explain a concept that Jesus is trying to explain to the religious leaders in the area, right? He's having not necessarily like an argument, but there's like a debate that he's using this point to carry out a message. Um, so it says, verse 28, tell me what you think about this. Right? He's going to tell a story. There was a man who had two sons. He went to the first son and said, son, go and work today in my vineyard. The son answered, I will not go. But later the son decided he should go, and he went. Then the father went to the other son and said, son, go and work today in my vineyard. The son answered, yes, sir, I will go and work. But he did not go. Which of the following two sons obeyed his father? And I think that's like one of my favorite stories. I actually have this highlighted from years ago that I still has notes in here about. But there's this idea that, at least my perspective, is willingness isn't always defined by our desire to do something, but it's by our actions despite those feelings, right? You know, a clear example for that is that, I have a very busy schedule. I could easily not have this podcast, but I do so out of willingness because there's never going to be a good time, right? There's never going to be a time where I want to do something in the sense that it's opportunistic or I have free time. I do it out of what I feel is a duty to, my God, my faith, but also my own self development. Because within not having a lot of time, it's so easy to lose focus and to lose opportunities to work on myself in a spiritual sense where I don't make time to read or I don't make time to pray. And that's something that a lot of people my age struggle with because every single moment of our day is maximized. Everyone that I know works, 50, 60, 70 hour weeks, and there isn't enough time in our worldview to do much of anything. But the willingness is to find something within your your day or your world that can allow you to move forward despite your desire to move forward, right? And I see that a lot with people that may be wrestling with the idea of faith where maybe they're agnostic or maybe they're coming out of an atheistic or scientific worldview and they acknowledge the possibility of there being a God, but they're kind of willing to make a change, but they don't know what that looks like, right? For me, that willingness is even if it's uncomfortable and you don't want to do it, you put yourself in a position to move the ball forward. Maybe it's talking to a friend who knows the Bible or knows Jesus, or you're listening to something um, that is you know helpful in that degree, like a sermon, or you're doing that self research, right? You have to put yourself into those positions, even if it seems inconvenient, because there's never going to be a convenient time. And I was talking to my wife earlier, and one of the things that I had kind of made the connection to is, the opposite of willingness, in my perspective, is selfishness, right? So if you're not willing to do something, it's because it's not self-serving, right? It doesn't benefit
Yep.
you directly.
Yep.
So I think a lot of times when the younger generations, like the millennials, Gen Zs, Gen Alphas, we live in this world where everything is just so self-pleasing. We have everything at our fingertips, yet we almost have nothing at our fingertips. We have to create these breadcrumbs to kind of push that ball forward. And sometimes it's very small.
Yeah.
The willingness doesn't have to be um, a large endeavor.
No, no. I liked what you said there, Isaiah. For your generation, there's not the picture of faith right in front of you, whether it's a church relationship or uh, somebody that's coming alongside you to live with you every day. That can model that. You don't have that. And we readily had that growing up. And I remember many times just looking at our church, um, and just knowing what each individual in front of me on a Sunday morning was going through in their life, whether it was just coming through with young kids or having problems at work, and yet they were still there. They were faithful, not just with their attendance on a Sunday morning. It went way past that, um, and that was such a help to me as I was struggling on, you know what I mean, especially with a new piece there too, just trying to follow God as like a young person, like a teenager, um, where today I like can't imagine what it would be like working through some of those issues today. And I think you said it well. You know what I mean? You don't have the same markers. You don't have the same boundaries to help you out with that too. So I think you laid out well as far as what to look for and how to work through that. But it will take a step of willingness to get into that peace with faith with God. I feel at times uh, now looking back that we missed it obviously uh, generationally in handing off this faith and handing off a relationship as opposed to just a list of X's and O's, what to do and what not to do. And I feel that distance sometimes when I talk to uh, people that are younger than me, um, and sometimes it's hostility, sometimes it's a distance that's meant to keep people apart. And I kind of feel that, and sometimes I feel responsible. And I know it's not. I know it's God's work to draw people to Himself. But I guess my question for you is how does somebody, from my perspective, age, uh, bridge that gap? How do we take the step past that and communicate uh, some of the things that God's done in my life?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's not that I necessarily have ideas, but I find the largest disconnect between generations is how we communicate ideas,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
In older generations, they were so tied so closely to the church that the vernacular and the way that information was communicated was kind of in the social lexicon where even if you didn't actually have a faith in Jesus, you almost knew just by proxy of being in that society, right? Even if you were from a different faith,
You're right on. You're right
right?
on.
So it was a known thing, right? The stories and the tenets and the ethics and morals and all these different things. Most people went to Catholic school, or they had a family that went to some kind of chapel. It was so embedded and ingrained. But I almost feel as if that kind of kneecaps the future generations in a way, not necessarily because there was some kind of a shift in that kind of distribution of faith, but more so like the communication never like updated itself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So as technology evolved, there was always this idea of just maintaining the status quo of how we relay information.
I
right?
agree with that. I agree.
And one of the things that I love about the Gospels is how Jesus uses parables, right? And he even says in a lot of the stories, like, I speak to you in this way because you won't understand any other way, right? So he understands how we interpret information, and he was speaking to people in those times the way that they would understand things.
Yeah.
So he's talking about vineyards and fishermen and wine presses and wheat and all these things that we don't have a connection to anymore because you have like 4 or 5 generations removed to someone who owned a farm, right?
Yep. Yep.
And I think sometimes that can be a barrier to the younger generations because we're in this hyper technological society that is very, very brainwashed and conditioned to intake information in a very specific way. And the older generations don't really have the capacity to relate, not necessarily because of their unwillingness, but I think that the technology was intentionally created to separate the generations in a way to where there isn't a barrier where, well, there's a barrier between communication because you can't have this passed down like
Hmm.
oral tradition
Yeah.
anymore
Yeah.
because the oral tradition became digitized, right?
That I feel. I think that's right on, Isaiah. Right on.
Within that same idea, I don't think it's anyone's fault. I think a lot of it is structured based off of, how things were designed
Hmm.
to transpire. But I think that one of the biggest things that my generation does a very good job at is talk through things and trying to negotiate ideas. Where if we don't understand an idea, we're trying to find ways to compare it to. But older generations want to relay information as it's written and don't really want to have to deviate from that.
Correct. That's
Right.
correct. Accurate. I think as a generalization. Yeah.
Yeah, as a generalization.
Yep.
And it doesn't mean that you change anything about the message, right? But I think sometimes when I see people talking to others about faith, um, there's this lack of empathy and understanding of how they're able to digest the information that they're being received. And,
Yeah.
and it becomes very prescriptive versus, you know, grace filled in a way, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I said there used to be um, a saying, when on wherever you encountered somebody that was your elder in age, um,
Mm,
and the saying went something like, you sit still while I instill. In other words, just carried the notion that age, obviously I'm smarter, wiser, so I'm going to talk and you just
mm.
listen and do whatever I say. And that's um, not how healthy communication should happen. I see you guys definitely doing a better job with that as far as give and take. And especially with scripture, I mean, it's definitely we're each an individual person. Nobody's got the same playbook. God's got his hands on each one of us in a different way. He's going to use us in a different way. So why do we expect me to look like you or you to look like me spiritually? Or what God wants of us. And I think that's something that we didn't have, and that could be one of um, the same one of the barriers as well too. This cookie cutter mentality when it comes to Christian spirituality or godly spirituality, and following after Him. It's about more than making cookies. God's got a hand in it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I don't necessarily have an answer because I don't want to appear as an authority in anything.
Yeah.
Uh, but I do notice the separation in communication, and I see it secondhand, firsthand. When I'm at work and I'm witnessing someone. have an interaction with, maybe a believer or someone who has faith, and the way that they're talking to them, it's, you know, it is almost very, uh, cryptic and hard to kind of understand. And I find any of the opportunities that I have to kind of share either my life story or things that God has done for me in my life, I do so in a very, um, digestible manner, that I'm trying to also understand how the person I'm talking to is going to receive the information, versus I'm just going to repeat what my mother and whoever else said something,
Yeah.
then you start to just kind of sound like a broken record. But I think it's a problem for the times, right? Where it's very specific to the world that we live in. I don't think it's an outdated issue, right? Where it's like there's nothing about the Bible that is outdated.
Yeah. That's correct.
Like I refuse to stand by, any of the people that would think that. But there are ways of relaying information that become detrimental to future generations. And
Mhm.
that's where I kind of see things. And one of the reasons why I do enjoy the idea of this podcast is, you know, the younger generations have a very short attention span, but they also have a very long attention span in some ways too. Like we like long form information, like podcasts and, audiobooks. And on the duality side of that, then you have things like TikTok and Instagram, where your brain is getting scrambled by something that's like 6 seconds or less, right? But there is ways to kind of penetrate, people's understanding of these concepts without having to change too much. And I think
Yeah.
it's just the desire to negotiate, right? The desire to ask someone, like, listen, I might not have all the right words for you, but if you let me know a little bit about yourself, maybe I can relay this information to you in a way that you'd understand,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that coaching has done for me in that sense is, one of my mentors would always tell me that, communication is negotiation, right? So when you're talking to someone, the action of me communicating an idea to them, I'm negotiating how they're going to perceive it, how they're going to use it, and how it's going to impact them, right? So if I'm sharing my testimony, or I'm trying to tell someone about what Jesus has done for me, um, I have to speak plainly, right? But also in the same way, I have to have that understanding as well. At what way am I saying something for them to understand what I'm trying to say? And that's
Yep.
why, um, that's why I enjoy what I do, because I get to practice, speaking.
I can see that.
Yeah. Yeah. In the last episode, I had a couple of how it abruptly ended. The file got corrupted and it had
Oh,
to end like prematurely. So
okay.
there wasn't like an intentional drop off on the episode. It just, for whatever reason, my low tech recording of it just kind of broke up the last 10 minutes, which I thought were the best 10 minutes on the episode. But maybe we'll recreate that on a later episode. My plan for this series is probably going to be over 3 episodes, just kind of going over this idea of what willingness really looks like. How do we implement it? How do we define it? And just kind of using scripture to kind of either back up these ideas or ask better questions going forward, right? Um, I do want to just kind of remind the listener that we do have an email that you can email questions or comments. That's the Generation F podcast at gmail.com. Had a couple of people use it already. I do want to use questions to kind of be a larger segment in some of the episodes in the future. Um, otherwise, I do appreciate everyone for listening. Thank you for being patient with us as we kind of figure out the technology. And we're going to leave you. And we hope you have a good rest of your week, and we plan to be live again. We plan to upload another episode next week by Tuesday.
Awesome.
Yeah. How do you think that went?
I think it went well, dude. I really do. I think there is much more to unpack there with unwillingness or willingness. It's just because it is tied to faith, dude. It really is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think willingness is faith,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like,
Absolutely.
I think it was in Exodus I was reading earlier, and it was talking about how like, Moses, didn't want to be sent, but he went anyway, right? That
Yeah.
is faith. It's like we don't want to put all our trust in something that we can't see, but we do it anyway. That's
Yeah.
willingness, and that is the definition of faith, in my opinion.
Absolutely. All right. Let me see if I can. Am I able to switch this around here? Uh, how do I
Are you
change
looking
camera?
for like a camera switch?
Yeah, so I can switch it around so I can
Oh,
show
if
you what I.
if if you go on the top right, there's a camera button that
Yep,
looks like it has like a recycling.
there we go. Got it. So that's my wife and I. Sorry.
That's okay.
There's the setup. So that's the
Oh wow.
mic stand, and then that's the little. He's tying the headphones into that. That's that phone
Oh
jack
wow.
there. And then he's got that's the mic. He's got the little stand there. So I'm going to see if I can get you set up with this dude as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's like a really nice setup.
Yeah. Didn't he just said use it for as long as you need to, but I want to get you some. So that
Yeah.
makes sense.
I mean, I think I have a mic. I just don't have the box and then the
Yeah.
headphones.
That's what I'm going to talk to him about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, it is because
We'll
it's
we'll do.
it's 100% clear now. I mean, this feels like it's
Yeah, you have like a very deep voice with it,
yeah,
you know. Like in the like it comes through like a lot better. I like it a lot.
sounds good, dude. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
definitely I definitely will. I'll talk to him. We're running
Sweet.
out. I think I got to take his car over to the garage tonight here yet. He's got to drop it off for work tomorrow, so I might see
Geez.
him tonight here yet too. So this
Yeah,
worked out
yeah.
really well.
No, it worked out for me too because I got out at 8 and I didn't get home till like 8:15, and I was like,
Isaiah, are you serious?
yeah, I was just like frantically like trying to like bring my notes together. But
Oh my.
yeah, that's the thing is like I'll never have the time.
Yeah.
So it's not
Yeah.
about me like, you know, that's the part of the witness. Like I have to do it. I feel like I have to do it, you
Good
know?
for you. Good for you.
Yeah.
I applaud you for that. I really do.
Yeah. All right.
All
I
right,
gotta
buddy.
eat. I gotta eat.
Go. Go.
See you
We'll
tomorrow.
catch you tomorrow, man.
Yeah.
All right, buddy.
All right, man.
See you.
See ya.